Housing Minister Jill Green recently held a media conference in Moncton to announce a new set of measures to address a province-wide housing crisis. The crowd included members of New Brunswick ACORN, a group that has called for the province to reinstate a limit on rent hikes. It's a policy which the Higgs government implemented temporarily in 2022. Critics say without that kind of protection for low-income renters, measures in the government's new strategy are unlikely to make a dent in the affordable housing shortage. But Green made it clear that a rent cap was not part of the new strategy.
One of the things that is not in here, and I know everybody's going to ask me about it if I don't talk about it, so I'm going to talk about it. The rent cap is not in the strategy. This strategy supports 4 different pillars to keep the building going, to satisfy the new supply that we need and to support it so that it actually can happen. We're putting funding in place. We're increasing the contributions that the province is making towards our affordable housing units. We're providing more rental supplements directly to tenants. We've put a number of new rent control measures in place over the last few years, and we will continue on with those. The one thing I will say about this plan is this is a start. This is not the finish.
Green said that she chose not to implement a rent cap in part because she heard from other provincial housing ministers that they had a myriad of problems because of rent caps. During the news conference, the minister also outlined new programs including a rent bank, which is meant to help renters avoid evictions or obtain new accommodations through short-term loans of about $1,500 per household. There's also a new benefit which is meant to remove 3,000 households from the province's wait list for subsidized housing. That list has grown rapidly over the past few years. In fact, it has practically doubled from 6,000 households in 2019 to reach 11,000 this year. Here's Minister Green describing some of the new measures.
So for tenants, we have created a $3 million fund over the next 2 years that it will be a rent bank for tenants in New Brunswick. And this will help New Brunswickers that have unexpected things happen in their lives, that puts financial stress on them, so that we can help them over that hump and make it so that they can maintain their housing and stay safely housed. For tenants, so this is the biggest game changer in the entire strategy, in my opinion. And for so many different reasons, this is, I think, the biggest game changer. We have are going to provide $22 million fund annually that is a direct to tenant rental benefit. So this rental benefit goes directly to the tenant. It does not go to the landlord. The tenant's neighbors do not know they're receiving this benefit. And this is to reduce our housing wait list by at least 3,000 immediately.
The new housing strategy follows 2 summits that were both organized by the government in cooperation with the New Brunswick Real Estate Association. The NB Media Co-op asked Minister Green to respond to criticisms that those events were too heavily weighted towards the interests of business. Here's what she said.
The Brunswick Real Estate Association, shortly after I got moved into the housing file, came to me with an idea and some support. And they had already had some work around a housing summit put in place, and they were willing to let us hijack that to be able to do the work that we needed to do very, very quickly to get this strategy completed. So that's why we partnered with the New Brunswick Real Estate Association. We hijacked them, and they were wonderful to let us do that so that we could build on the work that they had currently done. We worked very hard to involve many, many, many different stakeholders, not only the summits, but we met one-on-one with many, many different stakeholders through this process. I feel like I've heard all the different voices around this, but as I said, we're just starting.
A representative from NB ACORN gave the new strategy a mixed review following the announcement.
There was many positive pieces of news in the announcement today, but what we're really looking for is a rent cap. Some of these new announcements on subsidies will have the unwanted effect of increasing rent prices by pumping more money into the market and inflating the price of rent. What a rent cap would do was allow rent to increase slowly across the market over time at a healthy pace. And furthermore, right now, almost 40% of New Brunswickers are spending roughly a third of their income on rent. That's a lot of money. So this is an issue that's impacting a huge chunk of the population, not just a small little niche minority. So we need solutions that are going to impact people across the entire market. As you know, there's a cost of living crisis, and people are struggling to pay for gas and groceries and all these different staples of life. The rent cap is one of the few tools directly within the government of New Brunswick's provincial government jurisdiction. The Premier of New Brunswick can't change the global price of a barrel of oil or the global price of a kilogram of grain, but they can input a rent cap that will influence the price of rent, which is a huge cost of living issue for a lot of people.
The opposition Liberals and the Green Party have both also called on the government to reinstate a rent cap in New Brunswick. Following the news conference, Green Party MLA Megan Mitten told reporters that part of the problem is investment companies called real estate investment trusts, or REITs.
The housing crisis that we are currently seeing has been fueled by the commercialization, financialization of something that is a human right, and that's affordable housing. And REITs, so REITs, real estate investment trusts, and some other forms of companies are really profiting in a predatory way from housing. And even in my community, there have been whole apartment buildings that have basically been flipped, and people have lost their housing. So this is something that I've been advocating for government to do something on, and I think they would need to coordinate with the federal government. But there needs to be some, they need to look at how to slow that down. And one of the solutions could be to offer first right of refusal basically to nonprofits or cooperatives in the region when an apartment building is going for sale, for example. And so there are ways to try to have things be more community owned, community centered, and empower our communities around housing, rather than people who knows where profiting by an extreme amount off of the most vulnerable people in New Brunswick.
Well, for more on this story, I spoke to Kristi Allain. She's a professor in the Department of Sociology at St. Thomas University in Fredericton. As a scholar, she's also working with a team of researchers on rent banks, and she's a member of the NB Coalition for Tenants Rights. We'll go to clips from that interview in just a moment. But first of all, the NB Media Co-op has been working on clearing up some confusion about rent banks. You may have heard that the rent bank in New Brunswick will provide low-interest loans. Minister Green made that comment in an interview recently on CBC Radio, and the phrase low-interest loans has also been repeated in some media reports. But as Professor Allain states in this interview, rent banks typically don't charge any interest. The NB Media Co-op checked in with the Department of Social Development for clarification. A spokesperson said in an email statement, "Our goal is to keep more money in New Brunswickers' pockets. The intent is to provide short-term interest-free loans, but as we have said, several details on the rent bank are still being finalized. More specific information will be shared once everything is finalized." Now let's go to the interview with Kristi Allain, professor of sociology at St. Thomas University. This interview was recorded on Wednesday, July 5th. I started by asking Professor Allain for her reaction when she first heard about the new housing strategy.
I think I have two reactions. We were disappointed to not see a rent cap. I mean, a rent cap, if you are looking to make a big impact in securing affordable housing, a rent cap tied to unit is really the only way, right? We've seen rents rise in the province of New Brunswick, far outstripping the rising rents in other parts of the country. This is not a coincidence. We have an incredibly unregulated housing market here, rental market in New Brunswick. Landlords are raising rents at astronomical rates at a time, where tenants are being squeezed in lots of other ways. So this is deeply concerning, and I think the NB Coalition for Tenants Rights, ACORN, and others were quite frankly, shocked to not see the province really use this very powerful and meaningful tool that really has no disadvantage. We've seen landlords claim that it will thwart development, but we know in the province of New Brunswick that even when we had a rental cap on, there was a development boom in the province. We saw the most development in Fredericton, for example, that we had seen in decades, despite this rent cap. So, scholars who study this say that landlords often threaten that they'll pull development if there's a rent cap, but that's actually categorically untrue. And they've also said that it would spark development when they take it off. And we heard Stephen Pomeroy from McMaster University say the other day that in the provinces of BC and Ontario, when they actually rolled back their restrictions, their rent caps, and made adjustments, that they actually didn't see development spark. And in the province of Quebec, which has always had incredibly restrictive, has had strong tenant rights, including a rent cap, we've seen tons of development consistently. So this is untrue. I have no idea why the province would suggest that this was going to be for everyone when it's clearly not saving these precious few affordable units that we have when we see them disappear at rates that are, in the city of Fredericton alone, we lose more than 4 affordable housing units every week.
And I want to get to that in a moment. I guess, first of all, the other side of it was this rent bank that was announced. The government says its rent bank will support up to 750 renter households annually, helping them avoid eviction or obtain new accommodations through short-term loans of about $1,500 per household on average. So this is also something that renters' rights advocates had been demanding. You're studying rent banks currently, along with professors Laura Pinn and Tobin Haley. Tobin Haley is, for full disclosure, a member of the NB Media Co-op Board of Directors, I'll add. But could you tell me about the research, how it work, and have these seen success in other jurisdictions in Canada or abroad?
Yeah, they're a really lovely tool in a slate of tools to help keep people housed. And what we found, especially in the COVID era, is that people are pinched, right? They can generally make their rent and make ends meet, but then something comes up in their life. They have a sick animal, their car breaks down, and then it becomes really difficult. So they're either loans or grants, and we like to see often a combination of both. They're no interest. They're run by not-for-profits with wraparound services, and can help tenants in lots of different ways. And this is just sort of one tool where a tenant who's pinched can very quickly and rapidly, the not-for-profit agency would sort of liaison often between the tenant and the landlord, let them know that the money is coming imminently, and help get tenants out of a pinch so that they can stay housed. So ideally, the standard would be that we would want to see this securely house somebody for at least 3 months. But in reality, what we find is that it keeps people housed much longer than that. And people are being, people who would have been evicted are staying in their homes, because of these rent banks. Usually people can access them once a year. And they're a wonderful and helpful tool when something really bad happens in somebody's life. When COVID happened, a lot of people were sick. They got COVID. They couldn't go to work for various reasons, or they were unemployed for short periods of time. And these rent banks were really essential in keeping people in their homes.
Jill Green, the minister responsible for housing in New Brunswick, has said that this new system in New Brunswick will be modeled on the Manitoba one. But at the same time, in some of the reporting on this, there's been reference to low interest loans from the rent bank. So do rental banks normally charge interest? Does the one in Manitoba charge interest, for example?
No, in fact, any of the rent banks that we've spoken to across the country, and we've spoken to rent banks in British Columbia, in Ontario, in Manitoba, no, interest is not part of a rent bank. It's part of a bank, right? And I mean, we need to make a distinction. We're not asking the government to become a bank. We're asking them to fund rent banks. It's not helpful for tenants to amass massive amounts of debt, to be indebted to creditors, to have people calling them, to have interest accruing. We're supposed to be helping tenants get out of a bad situation. So usually these loans, they can cover 1 or 2 months rent. And there's no interest on this. In fact, the repayment schedule is often amortized over long, long periods of time at no more than $20 or $25 a month with no interest.
Going to some other points in the housing strategy, there's a new direct to tenant rental benefit that's outlined in the strategy with a $22 million annual investment. The report states that this will provide rental assistance to families and seniors, targeting people who are struggling with affordability. And any comment on this kind of program?
I think it would, to help tenants with affordability, of course, we want to see tenants in affordable situations. We want to see the government helping tenants who are in unaffordable situations. But to my mind, it would just be much more logical to impose a rent cap. Why provide public funds to fund basically private industries? Many of these private industries, companies like Killam, don't even pay taxes in this province, right? These are REITs. Why would we use $22 million to fund this when we could put a rent cap on and maybe help many tenants from, being in situations that they would require these forms of subsidies? So yes, I do want the province to help tenants in every way they can. But I think, it might have been better for the province to actually just impose the rent cap and help keep landlords, in line. There's no doubt that, we have inflation, that there are rising costs, but there are ways of using the rent cap and making it flexible and adjustable to make sure that it's fair. What we've seen in this province is we've seen landlords be profoundly unfair to tenants. And what's even more concerning is that when these tenants move out, we have an affordability problem in the province where we are losing affordable housing units. They are not being replaced. So even when there is development, the kind of development we see is at the top end of the market. These are luxury apartments where tenants are paying, $2,500 sometimes to live there. These are not affordable units. And when tenants leave their units, we often see landlords renovating them and moving them up the market. In fact, this is a strategy used by Killam itself.
I just want to jump in there because you mentioned this company Killam a couple times, which is a name that people might recognize from their communities in New Brunswick, because they do have a pretty outsized presence in the real estate, in the rental market in New Brunswick, and have sort of a recognizable signage around at their apartment buildings. And they're, as you said, a type of REIT, which stands for Real Estate Investment Trust. And I was wondering if you could just explain briefly, what is a REIT?
A REIT it's an investment. These are investment properties. They're held in trust, so they don't pay taxes here. Everybody owns a little bit, and then when you leave, you pay taxes wherever you, as the investor, actually live. So, perhaps some of the taxes are paid in New Brunswick, but more likely those taxes are paid in other more populous parts of the country. They're responsible to their investors, and legally they're responsible to their investors. Their job is, as a capitalist enterprise and company, is to extract as much wealth as they can from the places they operate in, like New Brunswick. It's not the fault of the REIT that it's raising rents. It's its business model. It's the fault of the government for not doing anything to help rein that in.
And of course, there's been many stories of hardship, notably throughout the pandemic, of renters facing really astronomical rent hikes, often after their building changes hands. And it seems there's a pattern of investors coming into New Brunswick to take advantage of what is relatively low cost real estate relative to places like Southern Ontario, I think, and very high demand for rental housing with a growing population. So just your thoughts on how these capital flows have affected the housing market in New Brunswick over the last period of time.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen it. It's a very lucrative business to come in to purchase a property, to change the business model, to raise the rents, and then you can remortgage, right? It gives you access to a little bit of capital, can give you access to much more capital. And you're right, because properties here have been historically undervalued, particularly rental properties. It's been quite the market to do this. It's disappointing that we haven't seen the province sort of on top of this earlier.
Going back to something that you were talking about earlier, the loss of what are called affordable units, and affordable is a word with a lot of different definitions depending on who you're talking to, I think. But in terms of the NB Coalitions for Tenants Rights, there was some research from your group indicating that New Brunswick lost over 8,600 affordable housing units between 2016 and 2021. And in this case, we're talking about units costing less than $750 a month. And in Moncton, for example, there seems to be a clear pattern, just anecdotally from local reporting, that low-income housing, such as rooming houses, are being torn down, while these new rental units going up seem to be geared towards higher income households. You were alluding to this a minute ago. Empty nesters, for example, who are downsizing. This is mentioned in the government's report. So can you comment on this market-driven approach to housing? Can we as a province depend on developers to create the kind of housing that people who are working in say fast food service jobs, for example, actually need?
No, the short answer is no. And also I should say that the report that you're referencing is also, it's in collaboration with the Home RL Research Lab at UNBSJ and Julia Woodhull-Melnick's team. And so we're deeply indebted to her and her research team for that work. We cannot depend on capitalist developers to build us out of this housing crisis, because the housing crisis is not just a crisis of housing, it's a crisis of affordability. We need people who are in minimum wage jobs. We need them to be able to afford to live, and to live in respectable ways. And presently, we're losing units at a rate that makes that almost impossible. It will be incredibly challenging for people to come to this province, to start their lives and their jobs in this province in meaningful ways. It'll be impossible for people to save for homes. If you're making minimum wage, $750 a month is what the standard is. We shouldn't be spending more than 30% of our income on our apartments, and we need more of those units. We're losing them. They're not being replaced, and developers will not replace them because it's not lucrative. They cannot make money on these units, and we cannot. We need the province to reinvest in this kind of housing, or to put strict rules in place for developers, forcing them to build and maintain this kind of unit. Well, at the same time, we need to stop this outflow of affordable units altogether. And there's a few ways to do that. Again, rent control tied to unit is a quick way to do this. Bring Airbnbs that are often naturally occurring affordable units back into the rental universe, quit letting private operators act as hotels, and take housing away from the citizens who live here full-time all the time. Those people deserve housing. The province actually didn't address either of these things, and municipalities, particularly the one I live in Fredericton, also seem remiss to really step up and make these changes to care for our citizens, our most marginal, our service workers, our minimum wage employed workers, or folks who are underemployed.
Kristi, there are many other measures noted in the government's new strategy. Some examples: funding for student housing, more subsidized housing. There's an emphasis on developing the skilled trades. I'm sure that we could talk about this for much longer, but I'll leave it at that for now. Kristi Allain, professor of sociology at St. Thomas University, thanks so much for speaking to the NB Media Co-op tonight.
Thank you.